Get ready to unlock the secrets of building an unshakable customer-centric empire. Welcome to the Relentless Customer Leader podcast, how customer-obsessed leaders win. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Brown, and this is a podcast that's going to ignite your passion for delivering experiences that leave your customers craving more. In each episode, we're going to dive into the minds of visionary leaders and trailblazing companies who have made customer experience their sacred mission. Prepare to be inspired as we unpack the game-changing strategies, unconventional thinking, and the real-world stories of customer-centric transformation. Whether you're a budding entrepreneur, a seasoned executive, or simply someone who believes in the power of remarkable customer experiences, this podcast is going to equip you with the tools, the mindset, the motivation to elevate your game. So brace yourself for a journey filled with great insights, inspirational stories, and contagious energy that will reignite your commitment to putting customers at the epicenter of everything that you do. My next guest is Ken Wilcox. Ken was previously the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, and in that role, he successfully pursued a strategy of expansion and diversification while remaining focused on the group's core niches of technology, life sciences, venture capital, and premium wineries. Banking is not necessarily an industry we associate with high levels of innovation, and yet Ken was able to earn the distinction of Entrepreneur of the Year by Ernst & Young, both in 2009 and 2010 for his work at Silicon Valley Bank. He earned an MBA from Harvard Business School, and he has unusually a PhD in German studies from Ohio State University. He's also written a great book titled Leading Through Culture, which distills practical leadership wisdom that can be applied to any organization. There are a number of powerful concepts, some of which we're going to touch on in this conversation, but I encourage you to go out and get that book and read it yourself. As you'll hear in the following conversation, Ken's really a very thoughtful, people-oriented leader who's mastered the art of organizational leadership during really challenging times. I hope you enjoy hearing more about Ken's leadership journey. Fantastic. Well, I'm here with Ken Wilcox, and it's great to see you again, Ken.
You as well. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I thought we could start this conversation by getting a little bit more background on really how your journey's evolved. I know that you have an MBA from Harvard and also have studied, you've got a PhD in German studies, which is quite an eclectic mix of different types of educational experiences. But tell me, how did you kind of end up, I guess, where you did with the banking role and the CEO role at Silicon Valley Bank?
Well, why don't I just go back to the German studies for a second and bring you up to date, starting at that point. I wasn't particularly well directed when I was off to university. I didn't really have any idea of what I wanted to do in life. I felt, though, that it was important to learn about other cultures. So I decided I'd pick a language and then do a junior year abroad sort of thing. And I just German. It could have been any other language for that matter. At the time, Germany seemed like a logical place to go for all kinds of different reasons. And there was no opportunity at that point. I want to underscore to go to China because I graduated in 1970 and people just weren't able to go to China at that point. So I studied German, and one thing led to another. I liked it. I enjoyed being in Germany. I kept on studying in Germany and ended up studying at 3 different German universities, actually. And ended up with a PhD in German. But what you find out when you do something like that is that your choices are more limited than you might otherwise imagine. If you have a PhD in German on your resume, there's pretty much only one thing you can do, and that's teach at a university.
Yes. Yeah.
Because anybody else who's considering you for anything else will look at that PhD in German and come to the conclusion that it's not a good idea. So I ended up temporarily, at least, teaching at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I enjoyed it quite a bit. But what I
Yeah.
didn't like was being poor. That was
Yeah.
in an era when raises for university professors in the humanities, and German's part of the humanities,
Yeah.
were 2%, and inflation in the US was 12 and 13%. So you can
Yeah.
see that I fundamentally lost half of my buying power in just a couple of years.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
went and went to Harvard Business School. I still didn't have any idea of what I wanted to do. So I decided I'd work in a bank, a commercial bank, thinking that that would expose me to a lot of different industries and I would have a better idea of what appealed to me.
Yeah.
I joined the bank in Boston. They told me I could pretty much work wherever I wanted to, but I would have to pick. And I looked at what was available, and it turned out there was a job in the technology lending group. And as a matter of fact, the one opening that they had in this rather small group was an opening for somebody who wanted to work with venture backed technology companies. So very early stage, but backed by venture capitalists. So I kind of on a whim chose that.
Mm.
And I
Mm.
ended up doing it for almost 40 years, in a manner of speaking.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
loved it. It was fun getting together with entrepreneurs. Venture capitalists were very interesting, and it was fun being on the cutting edge in terms of what was happening in the world of innovation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a fascinating journey, to get to that point. And I, I imagine your upbringing and sort of your early life also shaped perhaps your philosophy to doing business as well. I mean, how did that evolve? I guess over time, how did you
Beyond a shadow of a doubt. Now, interestingly enough, I came from a family of academicians, not business people.
yeah
Although most of the people in my family who were in academe were teaching organizational behavior.
yeah okay
And in that capacity, they often had side gigs as consultants to businesses.
yeah
So, and my father was, I think, somewhat of an idealist. He was so interested in organizational behavior that he pretty much lectured to us every night at the dinner table. And in particular, what I remember most was he believed that American business was on the verge of a major shift away from what he called theory X leadership styles to theory Y leadership styles. And what that boiled down to was up until sometime when I was in college, maybe in, or at least in high school, in the US, a lot of our management practices were based on our experiences in World War II. So they
Mm.
were somewhat militaristic, very top down, with clear levels of authority. The people at the universities that were studying organizational behavior were pretty convinced that that wasn't the best way to run a corporation. And so this whole idea of theory Y leadership came into being in the US, I think,
Mm.
sometime in the 60s and in the 70s. And the idea was that people wanted ultimately, this is kind of based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they wanted to self actualize. And to
Yes.
self-actualize means that you get to do some thinking on your own. Get to make some decisions and then look at the results and then reformulate your decision based on how well you've done. It wasn't all just taking orders from above and doing exactly what you were told. So I heard these lectures at the dinner table every night for several years during, like junior high school and high school.
Yeah, yeah. It seems to me that's been an evolving thing, hasn't it, over the last sort of 30 or 40 years, where there's been sort of this command control and sort of a very militaristic sort of style to corporations, to now becoming this recognition that's not necessarily the most ideal way of running a business, and actually people want to be able to express themselves and be able to really draw out their own talents and apply those in that sort of setting. So I think it was sort of early sort of insight there from many years ago that this was the direction that I think things are going.
Yeah, well, I was listening to all of that and tucking it in the back of my head, but not
Mm.
really doing that much with it
Mm.
until I actually graduated from Harvard Business School and got my first job. And my first boss was not exactly militaristic, but very determined to make all the decisions himself. And
Yeah,
it had I reacted to that very negatively. So
yeah,
I would say that, in fact, my second boss fit into the same category, and maybe my third one too. And over time, I came to the conclusion I don't really like this.
yeah,
And two things. One is if I want to avoid it, I better end up being the boss myself, I guess. And the
yeah,
other thing was, once I was the boss, if I was able to pull that off, I didn't want to behave that way because I didn't think that that would bring out the best in the people that worked with me.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You didn't want to impose the same experience you'd had on others, right?
That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
In your book, it really begins with sort of this idea of, the question of why do you want to lead? What is it that you that draws you to leadership? And I think part of that you talk about, understanding the underlying motivation to lead. How do you think about that? Maybe share a bit more about that concept of why people want to lead organisations or want to lead, and what the underlying motivation is, and how do you kind of tease that out? Do you think? How do you make an assessment of that yourself?
Well, of course, it's very complicated because human nature is very complicated, and there's nobody who's is simple enough that they fit into a category without any differentiation. But I would say, in general, bosses tend to fall into two different categories.
Mm.
One category is bosses who want to be boss because they like being boss, and it doesn't really make any difference what industry they're in or what the content of the job is. They just like telling other people what to do and being as George Bush said, being the decidinator. They love being the
That's
decidinator.
great. That's great.
The other kind of person, I think, is somebody who cares deeply about a particular issue or a set of issues or a way of looking at the world. Those kinds of people have a vision in their minds about the way things should be, and they never are the way they should be. They're always different. Those people are focused on changing things and making things better. And
Yeah.
they don't necessarily look to become the boss. Oftentimes they're selected because the people around them say, hey, that person's got a great idea, and they would like to take this place to a better place than where it is right now. So we'd love to have them as boss. And I personally believe that I fit more into the latter category,
Yeah.
with the one exception that I was definitely trying to escape being bossed around all the time.
Yeah. 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 That was a sort of negative driver of wanting to be boss, right?
That's
And
exactly right.
and that idea of vision. I know we've had a number of conversations over the years about customer centric leadership and so on, and one of the areas is sort of this customer vision. But for you, the vision, Silicon Valley Bank, and you outline this in your book also, is really reorienting around this venture backed segment, if you like. How did that come about for you? I mean, how did you develop that vision, and what were you seeing that sort of manifested that for you? Do you recall any
Really, there
triggers?
are two things that came together, I think. One of them having to do with employees, and the other one having to do with customers. And on the
Mm.
customer side, there were a couple of things motivating me. One was I got into this technology lending group really without understanding what it was all about, but I soon learned that the people in the technology sphere, in the innovation space, were, for the most part, trying to create products and services that would, quote unquote, make the world a better place. It would make people's lives better for them. Now,
Yeah.
in point of fact, it hasn't always worked out that way. I mean, there is the argument that in some regards, technology has worsened some people's lives. When you
Yeah.
think about the internet today and the social media companies. But in general, it's about making people's lives more pleasant and
Yeah.
giving them access to more information and helping them to self actualize. So that's on the customer side. In addition to that, on the customer side, I would say that banks, commercial banks in particular, don't have the greatest reputation, meaning a lot of people don't really like their bank. They don't like their bankers, and they feel
Mm.
that banks are very parental. So
Yeah.
I also had this idea that we should try to run our bank in a way that customers enjoyed interfacing with us, that they didn't feel they were being talked down to, that they didn't feel that we were treating them like children. So that's
Yeah.
on the customer side, two different things. But then on
Mm.
the employee side, there's the thing I mentioned before, that people really would like to grow and learn in their jobs. They don't want to just like drones do what they're told to do. So all those things came together in a way that resulted in my very definitely developing strong opinions about the direction the bank should go
Yeah.
in. And
Yeah.
somehow, some people who liked that noticed it and got the idea that maybe I should be considered in the line of succession.
Yeah. 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 No, no, it's it's an amazing journey that you've gone on to then take on the leadership of Silicon Valley Bank. I mean, how did that actually happen? Talk me through the sort of, I guess, that the experience of going from being in the bank and working your way up. I know you took a role on before the CEO role, but how did that sort of play out?
It was actually, from my point of view, quite a surprise. I did not imagine that people were thinking of people in a position to make decisions about the succession. I didn't imagine that people were actually considering me seriously or thinking about me, but they
Mm,
came to my attention, and I was quite surprised, and I was obviously flattered. And then I
mm,
saw the benefit that if I could
yeah,
do that, it would solve a whole bunch of different problems
yeah,
for me. And
yeah,
I was one day I was already at Silicon Valley Bank because I left Bank of New England in 1990 and joined Silicon Valley Bank. And one day in 1997, the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank, who'd only been CEO for 5 years at that point, asked me to go to dinner with him, and he said, he would like himself to retire in 3 years, and would I consider moving from Boston, where I was, to California, where our headquarters were.
mm,
And he promised me that all other factors being equal, if nothing went wrong, that he would train me to be his successor.
mm,
So
mm,
I talked to my wife about it, and her initial response was, "There's no way we're going to do that,"
yeah,
because people in Boston, even today, I think, don't necessarily have the highest opinion of Californians, nor
yeah,
do Californians necessarily have the highest opinion of Bostonians.
yeah,
But
yeah,
I didn't put her under pressure. I just talked to her about the benefits, and within 6 months, I talked her into it.
yeah, yeah. You crossed the divide.
Across the divide.
That's great. That's great. And so, you took on the new role and set a new direction really for the business, didn't you? To really narrow the focus on this technology market and really develop that. And it's interesting hearing your story because you there was obviously a CEO that you'd taken over, and that was a different business, and then you were really almost recreating the business in a way for the next phase of the organization.
Well,
When
that's
you
exactly right. Because when I joined the bank in 1990, Silicon Valley Bank in 1990, it had what we called at the time the three-legged stool approach. And the idea was that one-third of the bank would be focused on early stage technology companies, one-third would be focused on small real estate developers,
Hmm,
and one-third would be focused on what we called Main Street, which just means everything else in the world, small
yeah,
business, so to speak. But we we positioned ourselves from a marketing point of view as the bank for technology companies. Because bear in mind, there are thousands of banks in the U.S., and all of them are focused on all kinds of businesses and on real estate developers. Almost nobody is focused on technology. So that was the one thing where we differentiated ourselves from other people. So we made it appear that that's what we did all the time, but it turned out it was only about a third of the business. And then my predecessor, a fellow named John Dean, was not enamored of technology, and he felt that it was too risky, which is what most bankers think. And the result was that he reduced our exposure in technology, so that by the time I became CEO in 2001, we were only about 20% technology, and everything else was everything else. It was small business in all different sectors. But my thought was at the time, and I still stand by that, I think it was a good idea. With every other bank in the country, if not the world, focused on a variety of different businesses and also focused on real estate, we should try to be in the one market that differentiates us. Plus, we developed some particular skills there. So why not do the one thing where we actually have a leg up on everybody else? And so in the first couple of years of my tenure as CEO, I made three big decisions. Two of them are relevant to this discussion. One of them was that, well, actually, all three are relevant. One of them was that we would drop everything else that we were doing over time and focus exclusively on the technology space. So we did that. Within the course of about 3-4 years, we reduced our exposure to everything else with one small exception, that being wine. We reduced everything else to zero, and we became a 99% technology-oriented bank. And then the other two things we decided to do, and these are really my only three big contributions to the bank's strategy over time. The second thing was, prior to my becoming CEO, we only worked with small companies, small technology companies, early stage technology companies. And in a sense, we were not doing ourselves a service because we were doing the hard work. It's difficult to work with very early stage technology companies, and they are risky. And then when they got to a certain size, we sort of gracefully let them go to other banks that were bigger. So we decided that we would invest a lot of money in product to enable us to adequately service larger technology companies. In other words, we'd find them when they were at inception, but we'd keep them. And to keep them happy. And then the third thing we decided to do was go global, because technology is a global business. And my feeling, which I still think was on the mark, was that if we didn't go global with our customers, that somebody else might. And so it was really important that we accompany them on their global journey. And most technology companies historically have gone global over time.
So, I mean, it was fundamentally about differentiating the bank in a way that made it unique, made it attractive, valuable, and so on. And no, it made a lot of sense.
But we did keep the wine because it was just too good to give up. We actually, at one point, banked more wineries than any bank in the country, maybe the world. I don't know about that, but than any bank in the country.
And a lot of these would have been up in Napa Valley, I guess, were they? Or
that's right. It was almost exclusively in Napa and Sonoma.
And you know, so you were really leading the bank at a time that was very challenging, a very challenging economic time, and so on. And if you think then, sort of shifting back to leadership and your own thoughts on leadership and leadership style. I mean, how would you describe your leadership style and sort of some of the key attributes that you felt were important and that you sort of promoted in the bank?
Well, first of all, let me address an issue that you just touched on a minute ago. I became CEO in the April of 2000,
Wow.
which in retrospect turned out to be actually almost exactly the onset of the big recession that was ushered in by the dot-com companies, total disintegration of the dot-com companies in the
Mm.
US.
Yeah.
So in the first year or two of my being CEO, I was definitely persona non grata with Wall Street because every quarter was worse than the one prior.
Yeah.
And I remember certain analysts at certain investment banks on Wall Street that were pushing me all the time to have a big layoff.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I just didn't want to do it
Mm.
because I believe it takes about 10 years to develop a good technology lender from
Mhm.
start to maturity. And
Mhm.
if we were to let a whole bunch of them go, lay them off, first of all, they'd go to competitors.
Mm.
And
Mm.
secondly, I'd never be able to get them back. And third, within a couple of years, things would turn around and we'd need them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I just put on my blinders and wouldn't listen and
Mm.
forged
Mm.
on ahead. And that worked out. That was a good strategy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in
Yeah.
terms of leadership strategy, I would say that I can almost encapsulate my leadership strategy with just a one small story. And
Mm.
that's when I became CEO, I didn't know how to be a CEO. I really and truly didn't.
Mm.
And for the first year, I was kind of grasping for straws. I was trying to figure out how do we go about doing this in a way that A, works, is effective, but B, also does what I'd initially set out to do, and that is enable people to quote unquote self actualize through
Yeah.
their work. And my thought was, I've got to figure out a way of making decisions that doesn't make me the sole decision maker. So I looked around and I did some reading and I got a consultant. And within a year, I discovered my only mentor, who's been dead for about 3,000 years now, I think.
Mm.
It's
Okay.
Cyrus the Great, who
Okay.
was I think around 3,000 years ago. I'm not sure I remember the exact dates anymore, but was the
Mm.
head of what's now Iran and was
Okay.
Persia at the time. And we know almost nothing about Cyrus the Great anyway, because archaeologists just haven't discovered much. But they did dig up at some point a bust of Cyrus the Great. And there was an inscription on the bust that said, "Diversity in council, unity in action."
Mm.
And I
Mm.
thought,
Mm.
my God, I've read a lot of biography, and most of the great leaders, in my assessment, have actually subscribed to this particular notion.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's a
so we
powerful
turned it
concept.
into a management style. A
Mm.
few of us sat down together and thought about that and turned it into a management style, a way of thinking about running a corporation that really has worked well, I think. And here's the idea. Number one is, as CEO, I don't want to be making all the decisions. That's ridiculous for two different reasons. Number one, it's impossible. But number two is you want to give other people the opportunity to grow. And part of growing in an organization is making decisions.
Yeah.
So as decisions appeared that needed to be made, I would divide them into two categories: the ones I wanted to make and the ones I wanted to push down. And I encouraged everybody at the next level to do the same thing so that we were pushing decisions down to the ground floor as far as we
Mm.
could. And
Yeah.
to the extent that we kept them for ourselves, try to make them only big ones that are relevant to your level of leadership. So fundamentally, I didn't make many decisions at all,
Mhm.
just a handful of them, and I pushed everything else down. And then when I did have to make a big decision, I would pull together a small group consisting usually of my direct reports and maybe a couple of subject matter experts in the corporation. And we would have a discussion. And at the beginning of the discussion, I would describe what it is that we're discussing, what's the decision. And I would make it clear that this is my decision. It's one of
Yeah.
the very few that I'm taking for myself. But I
Yeah.
don't want to make the decision in a vacuum. I want the value of their expertise and their thinking.
Yeah.
So the idea was you have to tell me what you think. You have to discuss it with me and tell me what you think. That's what I'm paying you for. And I
Mm.
really, really, really want to know what you think. And then
Mm.
sometimes those discussions would be going on for an hour, sometimes 3, 4 hours. Sometimes they'd extend themselves over a couple of days. And then there would come a point in time that I sensed intuitively where we discussed it to the extent that we needed to. And it was
Mm.
time to make a decision. That was mine to do. I would
Yeah.
make the decision.
Mm.
And again, I limited myself to very, very few decisions. And
Yeah.
then the second part of it is carrying out the decision.
Mm.
And
Mm.
that is what Cyrus the Great was referring to apparently as unity in action. So the diversity in council was the discussion part, where the rule was you had to tell me your opinion. Don't worry about whether or not I'm going to disagree with it, because I wouldn't do that openly anyway. That would just discourage people.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
Then the decision gets made, and then the third part of it is carrying out the decision. And there it was the other way around. There we wanted unity,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and people had to support the decision. If they didn't want to support the decision, they had to stand down. And if they wanted to be disruptive, they had to go away. But they had to support the decision,
Yeah.
and that turned into a management style for the whole corporation. And we made that into a seminar, and we taught people up and down the corporation through our ever ongoing seminars on Cyrus the Great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, over time, we quit calling it Cyrus the Great. We called it the 3Ds:
Okay.
discuss, decide, deliver.
Okay.
And there was a time when there wasn't a person in the whole corporation who didn't know what the 3Ds were.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a
And then
very powerful philosophy, isn't it?
it?
Yeah, yeah, it's a very powerful philosophy. It sort of reminds me too, Ken. I think that last bit, right, of unified action is it. I'm just thinking about Amazon's idea of Jeff Bezos talks about disagreeing and committing, and so that's the
Yeah.
challenge piece, isn't it? So you have the disagreement up front. You might not believe in it, but then at a certain point, for the organisation, you need to commit to doing it, to making it happen, to executing, to moving forward. And that kind of leads me into to thinking about this other idea that you had in your book around the spectrum of human behaviour and the types of people from on two axes here. Maybe tell me a bit more about that, because I think it requires adults to really be able to execute the way that you've described.
Thank you very much for that opportunity, because that's something I'd like to talk about. But before I do that, I want to add one more small point to the whole idea of Cyrus the Great.
Yeah.
And that is, I believe if the leader tries to make all the decisions himself or herself, that he'll end up with less than optimal people. Because the ones who are creative and thoughtful will want to be making decisions, and they'll get fed up over time, and they'll go someplace else. So you'll be left with people who don't want to make decisions.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you're forced to make all of them yourself.
Yeah.
But anyway, the spectrum of human behavior, that is something that sounds probably a little bit more scientific than it actually is, but it's something that I came up with. And it's the idea that you can place everybody in any organization on a spectrum.
Mm.
And in the middle of the spectrum are what we call the adult to adult people. Those are the people that realize that if you're working together with other adults, that you're going to have differences of opinion. And if you're an adult, you're going to figure out how to discuss your way through those differences of opinion and come to some kind of conclusion that you can both execute on, that you can both be reasonably happy with. So those people are in the middle of the spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, we have what we call the passive aggressive people.
Mm. Mm.
Those are the ones that hate confrontation. And so they always pretend like they're in agreement with you. No matter what you say, they smile and shake their head. And you think they're in agreement. But, the next day you find out somehow, or maybe a week later or 2 weeks later, that they never agreed with you in the first place, but they're just pretending.
Yeah.
And they're really very dangerous for a corporation because they're disruptive. They won't execute on the decisions that we all agree to. The other end of the spectrum is the people that are almost the opposite. Those are the obnoxiously assertive people. They're the ones that love confrontation, and they feel that they have to get their way all the time, and they'll browbeat other people into accepting their ideas.
Yes.
So once I'd figured this out, I decided that what we needed to do is get rid of all of the people at the ends of the spectrum, either by coaching them to the middle or by inviting them to go work someplace else. And of course, I couldn't do that by myself. So that required a lot of, we taught the various levels of people how to deal with those types. And within about a year and a half or so, we got rid of all of the obnoxiously assertive people, either by coaching them to the middle or by asking them to leave.
Yeah.
I will admit, it's hard to get rid of passive aggressive people. Because you don't know who they are.
Yes. Hard to uncover that.
They're hiding.
And thinking about coaching it too, Ken. I mean, how would you coach someone that sort of has that sort of passive aggressive, where they're sort of just undermining things and how do you bring
that in a progression? We would begin with the manager. So if it was somebody who reported to me, by way of example, I, being the manager, would have a couple of sessions with them and talk to them about how this it's not consistent with the culture we're developing. And in our opinion, it doesn't make for an optimally run organization. So would they please think about it and try to do better? And if that didn't work, if after a couple of sessions with a single manager didn't induce some change, then we would have an intervention where we'd have 3 or 4 managers get in a room with them. And that would border on threatening, in the sense that this group of managers would say, look, it's not just your boss who feels that way. The rest of us do too. And if you can't fix it, we're going to wish you the best, but we're going to ask you to go someplace else.
To move on.
That worked. It worked with the obnoxiously assertive people. Again, as I say, the passive aggressive people, some of them stayed for years. It would take years to find them, to discover them.
There's another concept that's related to this, I think, in this chapter around building the great culture at SVB, and it's to do with cops and robbers versus the voice of conscience. Can you describe that concept a little bit more? Because I think I've seen that before.
That's an easy one for me to describe, because in my experience, most commercial banks run on a cops and robbers model. But what we were targeting was what I call the voice of your conscience, meaning everybody has a voice inside them that tells them what's right and what's not. And if we can just get them to listen to it and follow it, we don't have to be monitoring them constantly. because
Yeah.
they'll want to do the right thing on their own.
Yeah.
Actually, it's
Yeah.
something that I learned in my first job in banking. My first job in banking, we had a chief credit officer whom I remember so well. He just loved to meet with lenders in small groups or
Mm, mm,
bankers in small groups. And he
mm.
loved to say the following thing, what I'm going to say right now. He'd say, if you find yourself in disagreement with the credit committee, you should go home and look in the mirror and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I in disagreement with the credit committee? Then he'd pause and he'd say, if you find that you're regularly in disagreement with the credit committee, you really need to go home and look in that mirror again and ask yourself why. And then the final
Mm.
stroke was, if you find yourself always in disagreement with the credit committee, you should go someplace else where you can find a
Yeah.
credit committee that agrees with you. And
Yeah.
that seems so poignant to me, and
Yeah.
so on the mark. So
Yeah.
what we
Yeah.
did was we tried to make people, it's just like parents, when you have kids, you don't want to be telling them what to do when they're 30. You
Mm,
want to
mm.
build in them a voice of their conscience, which tells them what to do, so that
Yeah.
you're not telling them what to do when they get older. And that's what
Yes.
we've tried to do. And that is, in a sense, another way of wording it is turn all of our employees into adults.
Yeah. 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 No, it's very powerful. Very powerful. We talked a little bit about sort of leadership style, or was sort of um, touching on that. But what when you think of great leaders, what are some of the attributes that you think about? How would you describe them?
Chris, could you say that again? You froze up for a minute from my point of view.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was just asking about attributes of great leaders. What are the things that come to mind when you think of great leadership?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I think when I think about great leaders, I've actually done a lot of thinking about this. I think that there are three characteristics that you'll find in almost all great leaders. The first one is they're cognizant of the fact that people are copying them. And the truth is, most people are subconsciously copying leaders.
Yeah. Yeah.
They don't even know they're doing it. They just
Mm.
automatically do it. And probably the best example is raising children. Until they get to be about 13, they're meticulously copying everything you do. They're trying to
Yes.
turn into a mini you.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
when they reach adolescence, they almost turn it upside down and try to do everything the opposite of the way you do it until they get into their 20s, and then they come back home again, and they end up being just like you when they're adults. And so this is an issue. Great leaders have to be
Mm.
aware of the fact that they're being copied. So they have to display copyable behavior. They have to display the behavior
Yes.
they'd like
Yeah. Yeah.
others to exhibit.
There's a good term. Sorry, there's a good term to describe this. I think called the shadow of a leader, which is this sort of idea that the leaders they have a shadow, right, and it has an effect on others, and whether they're aware of it or not. I think in a lot of the work that we've done, we've seen, and we encourage leaders, if you want to have people to be more customer centric, if you like, or more interested in customers, then the leaders need to be someone interested in customers too, right? They need to
Exactly.
demonstrate some interest in customers. And if they're not,
Exactly.
then it's hard to change things.
And people, in a sense, are relieved when they find that leaders have foibles, because then they can excuse their own foibles.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, the second characteristic that I would associate with great leaders is that they don't try to make all the decisions themselves. They have a decision making process that involves others.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
and then the third thing that I think is really important about great leaders is that almost all great leaders are focused on the future rather than the present. Great leaders tend to delegate the present to their direct reports, and they focus on the future. And the future that they see is one that makes the corporation and the lives of everybody in it better off.
Yes. Yep.
People are more willing to follow leaders that are going to lead them to the land of milk and honey, so to speak. Take them to a better place.
Yep. I think you describe it in your book, building a great culture is about, care about me, help me grow, describe me the promised land and lead me to it. So I think that encapsulates it very, very well in terms of creating this great culture. In your own sort of leadership journey, I know it's not all up and to the right, is it? So there's lots of challenges along the way and things that haven't worked out the way that you've wanted them to. I mean, what are the things that stick out in your own mind in terms of things that didn't go the way that you wanted them to, or things that you hadn't worked out well?
Well, I'll mention two, one in each of two different categories. One of them is when something happens that causes you to realize you're not doing as good a job as you should be doing. And that, it's often hard for people to, first of all, recognize that that's happened. And secondly, if they do recognize it, to admit it. And third, even more difficult is to act on it. But I do know that at the beginning of my tenure as CEO, back in 2002, I'd been on the job for about a year, and the board wanted me to do it. So we did that. And I was shocked by the results because, of course, there were a number of good things that came out of it. But there was one thing in particular that was shocking to me. And I also realized that it was damning. And that is that I was viewed as too harsh with people with whom I was in disagreement. And I had to deal with it. And I did. But it wasn't easy, and it was obviously disquieting internally and embarrassing. But I had to fix that because the truth is you can't really get people to share their opinions with you if they're afraid of you.
Yes, yeah. It shuts that down, doesn't it?
Yeah. It shuts it down. Yeah. So that was one thing, and that's on the personal side. On the bigger side, I'll mention a huge flop in my third year or so as CEO, and that is that I had this vision, which I think was the right vision, and I was in the process of executing on it, and that was that we weren't going to be just a commercial bank. We were going to try to line up, meaning either purchase or develop within all of the various products and services that technology companies need in the financial arena. So we would be like one-stop shopping. We'd be more than a bank. And one of the things we felt we needed to have was a boutique M&A firm, because it's axiomatic that the vast majority, if not all, technology companies ultimately get purchased by somebody else. And why shouldn't we be part of that process? Why shouldn't we help them find either the right acquirer, or if it's the other way around, the right target to purchase? And so we did. We spent about a year looking, and we finally identified a boutique investment bank that was exclusively involved in technology, and we purchased it. But it didn't work out the way we'd hoped it would. And fundamentally, that decision caused the loss of, a couple of $100 million.
Wow.
But the other side of the coin was, we had a great chairman, in my opinion anyway. The chairman of our bank was really a smart guy, very urbane, very wise. And he said, yes, that was a bad mistake, and it would have been better if you hadn't made it. But the organization learned so much in the process, and in a sense, elevated itself up to a higher level. and became a much better organization as a result of this process of acquiring that boutique investment bank and then ultimately failing.
Yeah.
So he said it was a learning experience and that we should get back up on our horse again and try harder next time. And I think that's the way to deal with
Yeah.
failure.
Yeah. I mean, it's $100 million investment in education.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. And it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
And I do think that our organization was much better off, much more sophisticated at the end of that process than we had been at the beginning.
Yeah.
And it's one
Yeah.
thing that actually enabled us to take on ever larger clients so that we could keep our technology companies longer as they matured. That may sound like
Yeah. Yeah.
rationalization, but I
No,
believe
that's
it's
yeah. Do you what what do you think went wrong with that in terms of that acquisition? Because it's always a challenging area, acquisitions, isn't it? Because you've got
yeah.
different cultures potentially in the new business, and how do you integrate that and ways of doing things?
Well,
What
that's
do
a
you
good
think were some of
question.
the
And
reasons that it didn't work out?
I actually have thought a lot about that, partially because of the big mistake, but also partially because our organization had financed a lot of acquisitions, companies that wanted to acquire other companies over time. I
Yep.
will say that in my experience, or at least in my perception, the vast majority of failures on the acquisition front are the result of cultures. The cultures don't mesh. And
Yeah.
in this particular case, that was exactly what the problem was. These two
Yeah.
cultures didn't mesh. They didn't
Yeah.
mesh at all in a
Yeah.
variety of different ways. And that's a longer topic than would be
Yeah.
appropriate in the context of this discussion today. But it was definitely an issue of cultures.
Yeah. I'm curious now about this, Ken, because it leads me to think a bit more about the ability to assess the organisation's culture. We have some tools that allow organisations to essentially assess how customer centric their organisational culture is. Have you come across tools in your work and experience that do a reasonable job of giving you a pulse of the culture and a sense of where it stands?
I think they're out there for sure, but I honestly can't tell you that I can think of a tool that would be accurate and appropriate. But I will
Yeah.
tell you one thing: when you're looking at acquisitions, here's what the biggest danger is: you want to acquire something,
Hmm.
and you're looking at a variety of candidates, and it's a little bit like dating, meaning when two people are dating, they both want to have a deal, they both want a consummation, and they both are presenting
Yeah.
them the best side of themselves, and they're looking at the best side of the other person. And it isn't until they come together and actually take up housekeeping that they begin to notice that I really don't like the other person after all. And a lot of what I thought was true
Yeah.
isn't really true. And so I think it would be good if there were tools that would help. Although, again, I can't think of any just offhand. I'm sure they're out there. But more importantly, is not getting deal fever, meaning don't get so emotionally attached to the deal that you are bound and determined to consummate it, even if you suspect there are aspects of it that aren't right. And
Yeah.
that's what happened in this particular case. Both sides wanted to have this thing take place. And so we
Yeah.
began to ignore the differences.
Yeah. Yeah. There becomes a sort of confirmation bias too, doesn't there? Once you're kind of going down that path, you're looking for more and more reasons to do it, and sort of just automatically ignoring reasons not to do it, perhaps.
Right. And if you see the other side behaving in a way that you know is going to be unacceptable longer term, there's a strong tendency to say, well, that was just an exception. And it was just a
Yeah.
bad day. That's all.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly, exactly. I thought we should talk a bit about what's happened with Silicon Valley Bank. Obviously, there's some pretty dramatic situation happened in the last couple of years with the bank, and what do you think went wrong there? How did that sort of come about? I mean, I know there was certainly some really new technology that enabled it to really happen, which was something that perhaps couldn't have happened in the past because of the speed of people being able to withdraw money and things like that. But what's your perspective on it?
Sure, I appreciate that question, largely because I don't want to be associated with the disintegration of the bank. I am proud to say that I wasn't part of it. I was already gone by 5 years or so by the time this happened, but I have spent a lot of time studying it. I spent a lot of time talking to my former colleagues, and I've developed a view on what went wrong, and I'm happy to explain it. But I think it looks like this. First of all, I remember now somewhere around 2019 or so, maybe 2018, 2019, the world became flooded with liquidity. And part of it would have been associated with the COVID, obviously, because governments were pouring money into systems in order to keep them afloat. So having so much money in the world floating around resulted in more money going into venture capital than had been true previously. And if money goes into venture capital, in the US at least, and also to a certain extent in other countries, because we were in several countries around the world, if money goes into venture capital, it ultimately is bound to funnel through our bank at some point in time because we had such a dominant market share. So here's the short answer. Between 20 and 2023, when we went down, in that 5-year period, our deposit levels quintupled. They went up by a factor of 5. Our loans didn't increase because there was so much cash out there, people didn't need to borrow. So the result was our loans stayed the same fundamentally for 5 years, and our deposits, here's what happens. There are 2 bad things that happen. One of them, and I want to treat them separately. One of them is that you're tempted to do something with those deposits because they're sitting there, and your CFO is thinking, they're just sitting there and they're costing us money. We should deploy them somehow so that we can get a return. And so the CFO put them into long-term treasuries. Now, Banking 101 will tell you should never, if you're a banker, a commercial banker, put deposits into long-term treasuries. Because and here we're getting into something that for some people is a little bit esoteric and for other people is their daily bread and butter. If you put these deposits into long-term treasuries that pay interest, and interest rates go up, the value of your bonds goes down. And so, but they thought to themselves in 2018, 2019, 2020, well, rates will never go up. They've been low for 20 years. So it's perfectly safe. They're never going to go up. But guess what happened? All of a sudden around the world, the heads of central banks began to worry about inflation. So they started raising rates. The value of the bonds went down, and suddenly there was a big paper loss. And in some cases, that became a real loss. If customers needed their deposits back, they had to sell the bonds to get the money back so that they could give their customers their deposits back. So that's one thing that went wrong. And the other thing that went wrong is if your deposits, at least in the United States, quintuple, you become a larger bank, or in other words, you're viewed as an ever larger bank. And suddenly we went from being about the 40th largest bank in the country to being the 17th largest. Now, that was a curse because the top 20, size-wise, are subject to a totally different set of regulations, much more stringent, much harsher, with a lot more oversight, because the regulators want to make sure that the 20 largest banks don't get into trouble. So the regulators came in and they said, you guys are now one of the 20 biggest banks in the country, and you don't have adequate risk control people. So they forced us to hire a couple of thousand additional risk control people in a very short period of time. Unfortunately, a couple of thousand was a pretty high percentage of the employee base. And if you bring on too many new people in too short a period of time, you can't enculturate them fast enough.
Yeah.
And the result is your culture gets watered down. So I think that's my explanation. It's two different things there.
Yeah.
And I think both of them contributed.
Yeah. The other side of it I was thinking about, Ken, was on the customer side, it's always a bank's worst nightmare, isn't it? To have customers do a run on the bank, right? To want their money back all at once.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, is there any way, do you think, be any way of sort of mitigating that? Would there have been an opportunity to do that?
Here's the thing. I actually experienced another run on a bank 30 years ago, or something like that. In 1990, I was at Bank of New England. And the reason I left Bank of New England and went to Silicon Valley Bank is because the bank failed. And it was in part because of a run on the bank. But in that era, there was no social media. So it took 6 months for the run on the bank to play itself out.
That was a real accelerant.
Yeah. But social media enables people to communicate with each other so quickly that a run that would have taken 6 months 30 years ago can be accomplished in 24 hours.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Silicon Valley Bank. We had in particular a lot of venture capitalists advising their companies that the bank was in trouble, take your money out. And they did it so quickly that literally, I think somebody has figured out that it took only 36 hours to destroy the bank by pulling money out of it.
Yeah,
Pretty sad.
Yeah, it is. It is.
And the other thing, I know this sounds a little offensive, Chris, but I do want to underscore it wasn't the business model that did us in. In other words, it wasn't lending to technology companies. It was these other factors.
Yeah, and I think it's, there's big lessons around just the perceptions, isn't there, of what the bank's doing and how secure my funds are, right, that are so sensitive, that have to be so delicately managed, because as human beings, we're so risk and sort of fear sensitive, aren't we? And so, we get controlled by, if there's real threat or perceived threat, we take action very quickly if we can. And it was just an incredible thing to see unfold.
Well, you hit it. It's the prisoner's dilemma, in effect. And if everybody had been able to step back and say, wait a minute, if none of us pull our money out, we'll probably all be fine. But if some of us pull our money out, the rest of us are threatened too.
Yeah.
That's what happened.
Right. Yeah. Probably just a few questions to wrap up the conversation here. This podcast is sort of called the Relentless Customer Leader podcast. Is the name of the podcast. I mean, when you think of the term relentless, Is that a term that you can relate to, or what does it mean to you?
Well, it's not a word that I use, but I think I understand what it means. And I would say that a relentless focus on customers implies at least two different things. One of them would be that you don't rest until the customer's problem has been solved.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other one would be that you are so keenly focused on doing things that will make the customer happy or that
Mm.
will enable the customer to flourish. Both
Yeah.
of those things. And I do think they're both extremely important. And I do
Yeah.
think that one of the things that I always emphasized, and that accordingly other people in the organization emphasized as well, is never to rest on our laurels. Because we may think that the customers are happy, but we don't know with certainty unless we are constantly checking. And
Yeah.
if we're not constantly checking, they may be slowly drifting into not being as satisfied. And you can be absolutely certain that somebody else is going to come along and figure that out and figure out how to make them satisfied. So it's really
Yeah.
important that you never rest on your laurels. You always are driven by, it's a little bit the Andy Grove idea of only the paranoid survive. You can't
Yeah.
take your partner for granted, and you can't take your
Yes.
customers for granted.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And you have a new book on doing business in China that's coming out this year. Tell us a bit more about what that's about. And I know in your leading through culture book, there's an appendix on your experiences in China, but this is an extended version of that, I imagine.
It is. That's yeah. That the final chapter of the culture book is rather tiny, and it deals with the extent to which cultures in other countries end up being different, and that you have to adjust to that if you're going to do business in other countries. But what this
Yeah.
book is about is specifically doing business in China, and
Mm-hmm.
here's the background. I was there for 4 years, building a bank from scratch. With it was a joint venture bank, and so it was conceptually Silicon Valley Bank 50% and 50% the Chinese Communist Party. And you begin to notice if you live in China and you have lots of contacts with other people and you get together with other people and talk, you begin to realize over time that Western companies that go to China don't last forever. Some of
Mm-hmm.
them last for a long time, but in the end, they almost invariably lose out. General Motors is a good example because General Motors has been cited often as, well, that's the exception to the rule. General Motors has done so well in China. Well, that was true up until a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And General Motors is now in the process of extricating itself from
Mm.
China
Mm.
because when the Chinese Communist Party invites you to come to China, and often they do, often they encourage you, often they come to you and say, look, we've scoured the world and you're the company we need because you can help us. And you're flattered. And so you go and you build a joint venture. What you need to realize is that your goal and their goal are not identical.
Yes.
Your goal is probably to expand your market and ultimately earn more.
Yep.
And their goal is to learn stuff that will help them do a better job in the world market, ultimately, not just the Chinese market, but the world market.
Yes.
And so this book is all about it. My book is, by the way, I want to underscore that my wife and I loved our years of living in China. China is so interesting, so fascinating. It was such a great experience. But I also think that if you do that, it's important to realize what the process looks like and how you can make sure that you optimize. The
Yeah.
title of the book is
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Chowdo
a
and
very, very different place, isn't it?
yes. And the title of this book is The China Conundrum: How to Ensure That Win-Win Doesn't End Up Meaning That You Lose Twice. Or at least that's the working title.
I like it.
It's to try to help people do a better job when they go to China.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And it
I
should be
mean,
coming out
just
at the end of the year.
yeah. I think in your description of your experience there, you can see what a minefield it must be. I haven't done business over there, so it was a great insight into what the challenges would be if we were to do business there. But very insightful, very insightful. Well, thanks, Ken, for your time today. Where can people find you online? What's the best way to interact with you and your work?
Well, the truth is, right now in the process of developing a website, and
Okay.
I'm starting a Substack. But in the meantime, if anybody wants to reach me, my email is probably the best way to find me. And my email is red, as in the color red,
Uh-huh.
mga, as in the British sports car, 56, as in the year 1956, at gmail.com.
Okay. Great. Well, I'll hold up. I've got a copy of your book here on my Kindle or my iPad device here, but I recommend everyone go and grab a copy of that. It's a fantastic insight into what it takes to create culture, to create leadership teams, to really lead in organisations and create organisations that win in the marketplace and sustain over time. I think is what you were able to do in your tenure there at Silicon Valley Bank. So a great read, lots of lessons, lots of insights, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today, Ken. So thank
Well,
you.
thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me. I really appreciate it. Thank you,
Yeah.
Chris.